spent some time in Ukraine talking, I know, to a lot of people from different organizations. So what would be your also assessment about the other challenges the journalists have here?
Well, you start from the position that the media in Ukraine are relatively free, and there's a robust tradition of free media at times in Ukraine's history. So we're not talking about other countries where the press are much less free. But nevertheless, I think I have, in talking to journalists, I've got a strong sense of fear and of a chilled environment caused by the death of Sheremet, but not only by that, in which people are much less certain about the choices they're making and maybe a bit less brave than they were. And a sense that there is not enough solidarity amongst the journalistic colleagues within the country, so that I know there's a big divide between so-called liberals and so-called patriots, but I think there are bigger issues in journalism which should unite journalists and not allow these partitions and divisions to exist.
But no, if not to speak just about Ukraine, but the global environment of journalism, it's strange for me to ask, as a journalist, to a journalist, an experienced editor representing a journalistic organization, but there is some feeling and sentiment in some of the public that journalists are devote too much time on the media. And for instance, we do have this, even with the American president, of the tweets of Donald Trump regarding the wrestling on CNN, that, that aren't we overdoing this threat to us, like trying to do that, we ask for a special attitude.
Well, I think we're beginning to glimpse what a world without journalism is like. And that's for two reasons. One is the economic predicament of the press, and one is the political control of the press. And it's frightening. I think people see what a world without facts is like, and when you can't tell what's true and what's not true. And so I think people are more appreciative now of what journalism can do, but they're also very suspicious and mistrustful of it. And so I think journalism has to keep reminding people why it can be trusted, what it can do, why it's needed, because there's a ton of information out there which is not being produced by journalism, and some of it's very good and some of it isn't. And we have to keep making the case as to what we do and why we deserve people's trust.
Generally, what could be the mistakes of modern times the media could avoid? Being, a bit lost, I think, I would argue, a bit lost in this current environment of disinformation, fake news, social media, platforms being developed.
Well, there's a radical, revolutionary change in the way that information is circulating now. I think of it as a difference between a vertical world in which journalists pass the information down to people, to a horizontal world in which there's an ocean of information that is changing opinions, influencing things, and some of that is bad, as you say, some of that is fake, some of it's true, but it's very, very powerful. And I think the worst thing that journalists can do is to cling to the old-fashioned mode and say, well, we want to go back to that vertical world where we own the information and we gave it to you. You realize that we are hopelessly out of touch with the way that information is now changing. And that means we have to earn trust by being more honest and transparent about our sources. It means we have to change the tone of voice. We have to have more of a conversation with the public rather than lecturing them. We have to reassess what journalism is doing. I mean, I'm very hopeful, but I'm only hopeful if journalists can wake up and realize that the world is changing faster and more radically than I think they're willing to admit at the moment.
You said about this conversation with the public, and that's exactly the question, where to find this balance, because sometimes you think like, you need to preach, and it's not a discussion, you have the facts and an opinion, and sometimes you need clearly say, that's not about the conversation, what is right, but there are facts and there is an opinion. We've heard the, and also, so then will be the question, do you think the British media and The Guardian and the media alike also have lost the reach when we can speak about, for instance, Brexit?
Well, I think a lot of the coverage of Brexit was appalling because it was on the old model of preaching. It was, we're going to tell you on the front page what you should think. We're not going to give you both sides of the question. We're just going to tell you our opinion. That, I don't think, is what journalism is. I think it has to begin with facts. Now, facts don't necessarily just come from reporters. Facts can come from other ways of talking to the public. Now, most journalists don't want to do that. They don't want to meet the public. They don't want to talk to the public. They think the public are idiots, and they just want to be in the world where they press the button and send it, and you're still in that vertical world. So I think we have to relearn how to be journalists, relearn trust, relearn relearn the economic basis of media, but something good will come out of that.
It was under your leadership when The Guardian, together with a few other international papers, ran the WikiLeaks story, the first, like really the biggest there, investigation. And there was a lot of debates, there were books written about that, films made. Yet we are in a situation when WikiLeaks currently looks like a very partisan organization of Julian Assange. It played a role also in the US elections, takes a very clear political position rather than just being a platform which is all about the free access to the data. Having the relations with, some of the relations with Russia, if we speak about the RT, Russia Today TV channel. So after a couple of years, how do you reflect on that? How do you reflect on what you've done, on how you ran that story, to what it led? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I'll always defend the journalism we did in The Guardian. Julian Assange went off and did other things with his data, and that's up to him, and I don't defend that, but I'll defend the work that we did together, and that was a process of editing. So we did old-fashioned editing, and we did the same with Edward Snowden. He gave us the material and said, you edit it, and I don't want to edit it, you make your choices. And I think we did that responsibly and in the public interest. And I also want to make the point about the public interest and how it can't be for the state to define what the public interest is. Really important for journalists to remember that because I've heard this since being in Ukraine, that there's a sort of, if you're not patriotic, then there's a problem with your journalism. It's not up to journalists to be patriotic in their journalism. I mean, I can be patriotic as a citizen, but I'm independent of the state, and almost at a time of war or stress or conflict, it's more important to remember that. You have a duty as a journalist which is different from your role as a citizen.
You said that it's not up to the state to decide what is in public interest. Yet the argument I would hear that it's not up to the journalists to decide. Who are you to decide what is in public interest? Rather, we would trust somebody more credible. So what would you answer on that? Why then you would think the journalists would decide?
Well, it comes out, if you believe in journalism, if you believe there has to be a fourth estate, somebody who stands aside from the church, from the law, from religion, from government, from commerce, that you need those people in society, then you have to allow them freedom. And sometimes they will misuse that freedom, sometimes they will be irresponsible. That's what freedom is. But all the other alternatives are worse. So if you're saying that the state must have power over journalists, that never ends well. So the journalists have to be allowed to exercise their individual discretion. But of course, we should then hold journalists to very high standards and say, to earn that degree of trust and responsibility, you have to show that you're worthy of it.
You've mentioned that The Guardian ran the WikiLeaks and the Snowden story in a responsible way. But then there is a situation is longer than that piece, you followed the story. But still, sometimes there is a responsibility of the media which kind of give birth to huge phenomenon. So still I would follow up on that. Did you have any thoughts about what happened to the WikiLeaks later, and what role they're playing now, and also with the pretty dubious situation with Edward Snowden being not somewhere else as in Russia?
Well, I mean, WikiLeaks and Snowden, I think, are very different animals. They're very different, and I don't think, I honestly don't think Edward Snowden ever wanted to be in Russia. I don't think that was his life plan. And that he saw himself spending the rest of his life in Russia, and I think he's been quite critical of the Russians. But I think generally, as journalists, you have to sort of set aside the source, and you look at the material and you say, what is this material telling us? The source may have many different motives, good and bad, and I think generally you try and push the source out of the mind, and you look at the documents and you say, well, what are these documents? Is there a public interest in these documents? And you have to be prepared to defend those public interests. But as I say, when we did the Snowden story, I was asked to go to the Parliament, and the first question they asked me was, do you love your country? How can you be a journalist publishing this and at the same time love your country? And my answer was, but the thing I love about my country is that it's free, that the journalists can behave like this. That's what George Orwell was trying to write about in 1984, and we have to remember these lessons, otherwise what are we defending if we're not defending that basic freedom?
I'd like to go more about the financial part of today's media. One of the biggest issues today is that the independent journalism and even good journalism doesn't really have enough funds, and how do you see this future? We are often, I mean, I'm speaking for one of the independent organizations, always said that, look, you need to find a way to be sustainable, and we all agree on that. We don't want to be dependent on different kind of donations, grant and all. But then you start to, imagine and give an example of different independent media, and then you see that even for The Guardian, it's not that easy. No. So really, how do you see that, and what would you answer?
I don't know what the definitive answer for everybody is. So there are going to be some news organizations that have paywalls, and that's going to work for them. There's some that's not going to work. It's going to vary from country to country, up market, down market. The advertising market is going to work for some, not for others. I think there are going to be numerous different models. The Guardian is currently trying a membership model where you don't force people to pay, you ask them to pay. There are foundation models which are pretty successful in some places. Advertising at the moment is mostly going to Google and Facebook, but Google and Facebook are in some regulatory trouble. And I think the important thing is not at this stage of the revolution to say, oh, it doesn't work, or let's regulate it, or let's shut it down. You have to give it some time, but it's going to be a bumpy ride.
But do you think that there was a time when for us, it was really this mantra that if the media would earn their money, that would be the way out. And, that was some kind of the guidelines for the Ukrainian media in the 90s. And then it happened that it's not exactly the case. So we're thinking, is journalism really moving to something like some foundation are supporting the things of the public interest?
Well, I think a foundation model is not the worst model. And a public broadcaster is not the worst model. I mean, arguably the best organization in the world is the BBC. It employs 7,000, 8,000 journalists. They live all the way around the world. It does incredibly high quality journalism, and it's funded by the taxpayer. Not directly, but through a license fee. So sometimes the best journalism is not provided by the market, but by a form of public subsidy. And so I think we have to really concentrate as journalists, do our best work that we can, and if the support from that comes from foundations, that's not the worst thing. I think that the journalism that matters to people will survive. I think the journalism that was simply intent on building an audience in order to deliver to advertisers will not survive, because I don't think the advertisers are going to be there to pay for that kind of journalism. I think that's one of the things that disappears with the vertical world. But if you're doing stuff that matters, then I think people will value that.
And still, I think I'll ask that. And if you speak about generally from what the Committee for Protect Journalists is doing, and the probably rather global answer, the journalists feel insecure because though there were always issues with politicians and governments, there were not so many deliberate attacks on the media. You know, the journalists still, your press jacket would help you in the conflict if you are. And it's exactly now when you would be threatened just exactly why you're a press. And the press would be blamed. And press used to be blamed by a lot of authoritarian leaders, but you have it everywhere. So do you really see that, how we can answer that?
Well, I think we have to, if we're doing stuff that is important, that matters, then we will have supportive people. That's really important. You know, when we were doing the Snowden story, I had a very strong sense that people wanted us to do that story. Some people didn't, but sufficient people did. And so we have to keep rethinking what journalism is, why what we're doing matters, and we have to be true to that. I mean, I have to say, since coming to Ukraine, I've met some really inspiring journalists. I mean, people who are formidably resilient and determined in a young country, who do realize the importance of what they're doing. And if I could bottle that and take that back to London and show that to some jaded old journalists who are chasing ratings because that's where they're advertising, I think that would be a wonderful thing. So, you know, don't lose sight of what you're doing here in this country and some very important lessons that the rest of the world could learn from you.